Muy bien.
3, 2, 1, ¿me avisás? Empiezo.
Sí. Ahí, espera que se está preparando todo para mandárselo. Listo, ya puedes empezar, Alicia, cuando quieras.
3, 2, 1, ¿me avisás? Empiezo.
Sí. Ahí, espera que se está preparando todo para mandárselo. Listo, ya puedes empezar, Alicia, cuando quieras.
Bueno, listo. Bueno, buenas tardes. Buenas tardes a todos.
Espera que se está preparando todo para mandárselo.
En nuestra práctica diaria nos enfocamos fundamentalmente en la parte asistencial, sin darnos cuenta que nuestra actividad asistencial tiene una gran parte relacionada a la investigación, porque es el que está en la trinchera trabajando, es el que puede generar hipótesis, que tiene dudas delante de determinados pacientes, definiendo qué tratamiento será mejor o no. Por eso es desmistificar que solamente el profesional va a dedicarse a la asistencia, sino que hay un área que es de investigación que forma parte de nuestra actividad diaria. Teniendo en cuenta esta percepción, desde el Comité de Investigación de la Sociedad Argentina de Nefrología, decidimos realizar una encuesta para saber si esto era una percepción nuestra nada más, o si realmente no, esto era una proyección de lo que pasaba en nuestro grupo de colegas profesionales. Y bueno, confirmamos nuestra percepción, que todos queremos investigar y hay algunos obstáculos y ciertos tabúes, por lo cual pensamos que hay algunos destinados o predestinados a hacer investigación y el resto no. Así que les voy a compartir la encuesta como para que podamos compartir estos resultados que desde ya no nos han sorprendido, ¿no? Les voy contando, hicimos una encuesta con preguntas básicas. Las preguntas, la primera fue si está interesado en participar en investigaciones clínicas de nefrología. Por supuesto que 56 respuestas, el 98% fue sí. La siguiente pregunta es si ha participado en alguna oportunidad en investigaciones clínicas patrocinada por la industria. Tenemos que un alto porcentaje, casi el 60%, no ha participado en este tipo de actividades. Si ha tenido alguna oportunidad en investigaciones clínicas patrocinadas por la industria, tenemos un 60% de respuestas negativas, y si estaría interesado en participar en este tipo de investigaciones, el 90% respondió que sí, y si estaría interesado entonces en participar en investigaciones patrocinadas por la industria, el 90% dijo estar de acuerdo. La otra cosa es si desea recibir capacitación para investigación patrocinada, el 94% estuvo de acuerdo en recibirla, y si se ha desempeñado en investigaciones patrocinadas por la industria, en calidad, ¿cuál era su rol? El 73% de los que participaron fueron en carácter de subinvestigadores, coordinadores un pequeño porcentaje, y como investigador principal un 21-22%. Pedimos también que marcaran las áreas de investigación en las cuales estaría interesado en participar, y por supuesto tenemos altos porcentajes para lo que es enfermedad renal crónica, la parte de litiasis renal, glomerulopatías, hipertensión arterial, diabetes, que se lleva el mayor porcentaje, metabolismo fosfocálcico y lo que corresponde a hemodiálisis. Pero ustedes ven que están desarrolladas muchísimos temas, ¿sí? Entonces, como vemos, tenemos una población de colegas que desearían participar, un pequeño porcentaje que lo ha hecho en investigaciones patrocinadas, un alto porcentaje que quiere capacitarse en ellos, así que esto lo charlamos con la comisión directiva, nos ayudó un montón en hacer estos pasos el doctor Guillermo Rosadíez, y en trabajando en equipo desde la comisión directiva y el comité de investigación, se pudo armar este webinar, que es un placer para mí poder presentárselos, porque a través de él el objetivo es dar a conocer los avances en investigación en diferentes patologías en donde está implicado el riñón que se están desarrollando en otros países, y ver, no solo conocerlas, sino tener la posibilidad, en la medida que se pueda, de poder acceder a ellas. Así que nos pareció una propuesta absolutamente altruista y generosa, porque no necesariamente tenemos que estar en centros de mucha formación o con investigadores específicos, sino desde donde estamos podemos aportar a la investigación. Así que yo voy a presentar a la persona que ha ayudado a hacer este nexo, y para que esté presente, digamos, a quien confiamos plenamente en poder contar con su apoyo incondicional, que es la licenciada en nutrición Cristina Miller, que es gerente del equipo clínico y es pilar de la nefrología de PPD, que es una CRO, ¿sí? Así que, Cris, adelante para presentar a quien es tu coequiper en esto, ¿sí?
Muchas gracias, Alicia. Buenas noches, buenas tardes a todos, y gracias por la invitación de la SAN y por la colaboración en realizar todo esto. Nuestro interés desde PPD, que es parte del grupo de Thermo Fisher Scientific, como presentaste, es una CRO que desarrollamos ensayos clínicos y tenemos presencia en Argentina también. Queremos justamente hacer conocer cuáles son los avances, las novedades, cuál es el estado y cuáles son los intereses que tiene la investigación clínica, y especialmente la presentación de hoy justamente es orientada y específica para nefrología, que bueno, que ya lo van a ver en la presentación que vamos a hacer, que tiene un gran interés y un gran boom en este tiempo y que queremos que todos sean parte. Digamos, sabemos la capacidad que tiene Argentina, yo en mi caso soy argentina, mi colega David es de Italia, pero obviamente somos una empresa global y justamente queremos también contar con la capacidad que tiene Argentina para la participación en los ensayos clínicos que todos realizamos. Así que muchas gracias de nuevo a la SAN y a todos ustedes por la invitación. Por ahí es solamente decir que luego de la charla va a haber preguntas y estamos disponibles en todos, la doctora Lidia Martínez y la doctora Luxardo, digamos, también para responder preguntas. Así que bueno, muchas gracias. Y en estos los dejo entonces con Davide Garrisi, que es uno de mis colegas, en realidad es también parte de PPD, grupo de Thermo Fisher Scientific. Davide es el director ejecutivo y es la cabeza del pilar de nefrología de PPD dentro del grupo de medicina general. Es doctor en farmacia, química y tecnología por la Universidad de Padua en Italia. También tiene un MBA de la Universidad Católica de Milán. Fue profesor del área de asuntos regulatorios y aspectos económicos en el desarrollo de drogas en la Universidad de Ferrara en Italia. Y bueno, es una persona con muchísima experiencia y como él se autodefine, es un defensor de la nefrología. Y bueno, doy fe de eso, digamos, porque trabajo todos los días con él. Así que bueno, muchas gracias a la SAN de nuevo. Y bueno, antes que nada, David, te dejo a vos para que unas palabras.
Sí, muchas gracias. Pocas palabras en español. Antes de todo, me siento honrado por esta oportunidad de colaborar con SAN, co-directora de la SAN, Sociedad Argentina de Nefrología. Antes de todo, más sinceras felicitaciones por ganar el Campeonato Mundial de Fútbol. No tengo la camiseta de Messi, pero camiseta y corbata con los colores de Argentina. Così, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and I'm very happy to participate in this section of the SIN, the Argentinian Society for Nephrology. Today, I would like to present a section related to new advances in clinical research in kidney disease. Just before starting, a few words about myself. I'm Davide Garrisi, Executive Director and Nephrology Pillar Head in General Medicine at PPD, the Clinical Research Group at Thermo Fisher Scientific. I have a degree in pharmaceutical chemistry and technology and an executive MBA. I had the opportunity also to teach at the university before and while working in the industry. But the most important thing is that I really believe in the future of nephrology as a very interesting therapeutic area. And for this reason, I'm really a great nephrology advocate. So today, the first topic that we are going to cover is a review of the clinical research in kidney disease. These are very important moments for clinical research in kidney because, as we are going to see through this presentation, that's a very interesting therapeutic area that in this moment it's witnessing an incredible number of different research activities aimed to better understand the pathophysiology of kidney disease and to find new treatments in order to delay or to stop completely chronic kidney disease and its progression. But interestingly, let's just start with a little bit of history of kidney disease. Indeed, it is interesting when you're approaching kidney disease and studying where somehow the definition or at least the identification of the disease is coming from back in history. Once again, this is known since the 400 before Christ, when Hippocrates, that of course is considered the father of medicine, was already noticing that when bubbles settle on the surface of urine indicate the disease of the kidneys, and then the complaint will be protracted. But just trying to move from an historical perspective to a future one, that's another important information that I would like to share with you. And this is coming from a recent review in The Lancet of 2018 related to forecasting life expectancy and what are the main causes of death in the next future. And we can see here how among non-communicable diseases that are projected to rise in the next future, chronic kidney disease, interestingly, it's going to move from the 16th to the 5th position in the next years. So by 2040, chronic kidney disease will be the 5th leading cause of death globally. So what is new in clinical research in kidney disease? What we can really see that it's going to change the landscape in the next future? We are going through this section to try to answer to some of these questions. So first of all, what is the current landscape of clinical research in kidney disease? What's the current trend of clinical trials that are conducted in kidney disease, and specifically those that are investigating CKD? And finally, what we can expect for the future of clinical development in this particular area. If we consider what are the potential causes of chronic kidney disease, starting from the genetic, the glomerular disease, diabetes, and hypertension, of course, being the main causes, and also how chronic kidney disease could potentially evolve in end-stage renal disease, and what are also the two most common intervention in this moment, meaning, for example, kidney transplant and dialysis, we can see that in the overall landscape of CKD, there are new drugs and treatments and generally clinical research that is being investigated at every stage. So, for example, speaking about the kidney genetic disease of genetic causes of kidney disease, we can see how inborn error of metabolism, or for example, primary hyperoxaluria, Alport syndrome, and IPKD, are being investigated right now with a new set of medications that we hope are expected to come to the market quite soon. Then there is a very big chapter that we are going to analyze more in details in our next slides about the glomerular diseases, where we are seeing an incredible number of clinical trials that are being performed, for example, in lupus nephritis, IgA nephropathy, where a number of medications are expected to be on the market in the next future, or, for example, even focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. Then if we move to diabetes and hypertension, there's another incredible chapter of disease, for example, considering the SGLT2 inhibitors that have been testing in the number of clinical trials that are showing what is their efficacy in diabetic kidney disease. Then, speaking about chronic kidney disease, we have a number of other indications, and for example, there are incredible news about treatment of CKD anemia after the submission of some more recent drugs that are intended to improve anemia in patients under dialysis. And then, if we move into kidney transplant as one of the potential intervention, we would see that currently there are also some line of research that are investigating drugs that are intended to prevent delayed graft function. So in this case, to improve the outcome of kidney transplantation, considering also that there is a general aging on the type of kidneys that are being used, especially for from those coming from DBD, so dead brain donors or dead cardiovascular donors. And so this is going to be really important to find new treatments in order to improve the life expectancy of people that are undergoing kidney disease, and especially using, let's say, some older kidneys, or at least kidneys that have a higher KDPI, or, for example, even cold ischemia time. And then moving to dialysis, there is a mixed landscape of research that it's investigating anticoagulation, for example, columns, and also zinc columns that are used in cognitive impairment to improve cognitive impairment. And so there is another very big chapter related to medical devices that, for example, one of the latest development is also trying to investigate, let's say, artificial dialysis access for patients. So generally, very interesting landscape of clinical research right now for chronic kidney disease and all its related indication. But let's start from the basis, and there was a very interesting paper that was published online some months ago in November 2020. Well, I would say 2 years ago right now. And in this recent analysis by Guidehouse, it was explained, or it was showed that analyzing the nephrology market, there were several factors. One of these, it's definitely the high unmet need for patients that are suffering from kidney disease or for nephrology as an overall. And for this very high unmet need, this was considered one of the key areas for investment by the pharmaceutical industry. So among these factors, including also the endpoints and relatively faster approval tracks, all these factors, I was saying, they contributed to the increase of clinical development activities in nephrology. This is a snapshot of the online article that I was making reference to, and for those that are interested, you can take a look at the reference here at the bottom of the slide. But the most important thing is that if we consider just the period between 2017 and 2020, the number of clinical trials actually almost doubled. And this is just, let's say, the initial phase of this renewed interest in nephrology. And by a separate analysis that we published together with my colleagues Andrew Bevan and Dr. Carmichael Angeles in the clinical research group of Thermo Fisher Scientific, we are going to see how, making a comparison in the last 20 years of clinical research, this increase is even more pronounced. And actually, this is what we have done. This year, we have published in the Evidence Forum, that is one of the publications of Evidera, and we have also presented our results to a poster at the ASN, the American Society of Nephrology. We have published a paper called Advancing Treatments for Chronic Kidney Disease and the Rare Renal Disorders in Adults and Children, Trends and Opportunities. So what we have done here is that we have analyzed clinicaltrial.gov for intervention and observational study for drugs or biologics that were contained in the definition of chronic renal failure or chronic renal disease or chronic kidney disease, And we analyzed everything that was matching this definition between the 1st of January 2002 and until the 31st of January 2021, so the last 20 years. And in total, we obtained data sets of 1,038 records. And among these total records, we have excluded some because the primary study intervention was not matching our definition, or at least our intended use of the data. Finally, we had 844 studies that were included in the analysis. And as I said, our main objective, or one of our main objectives, was to make a comparison between the first 10 years of this period and the last 10 years of this period, in order to understand if this reported increase in clinical research activities and interest in nephrology is also supported by the number of clinical trials. And beyond the pure number of clinical trials, we also run some other analysis related to, for example, the study phase, the population type, and the type of intervention, in order to see if there were some trends in how clinical research in kidneys was changing in the period. So the first thing that, of course, we analyzed, it's the studies by phase of development. Now, a few highlights that are quite important here. First of all, the increase in the number of clinical trials between the two periods was by 54% higher in period number 2. So we had in the second period, so in the last 10 years of the period that we analyzed, 512 trials compared to 322 in the first period. But the most important thing is that if we consider phase 1 and phase 2 research, that for us working in clinical research, somehow it's the gateway for the largest phase 3 pivotal trial, the increase is 132%. So in other words, it means that in the last 10 years of the period that we evaluated, the number of clinical trials actually doubled. And this is very important because it means that higher research in the early phase, it means that more candidates, hopefully, are going to approach then phase 3, and in this case, having more treatment options available for the treatment of CKD and its causes. So again, just trying to summarize this first slide, an incredible increase in the number of clinical trials that were performed in the last 10 years, compared to the first 10 years of the period that we analyzed. The other thing is that if we consider the type of funding, we have also, apart, let's say, from this increase, we have also seen that there has been an increase in the non-industry type of funding of clinical trials, and generally non-industry, in the definition that we are using, it means, for example, trials that are sponsored by academia. And this is, again, another very important aspect to be considered, because generally we see that there is an increase in the academic type of industry funding that it's used in order to complete basic research. And then from university, this could be transferred as technology to, for example, pharmaceutical industry, or being a spin-off from university in order to have some core new biotech companies that can take an initial idea, or let's say a molecular mechanism, then into clinics in order to test the true efficacy of a potential new treatment. So in this second analysis that we ran, studies by type of funding, again, very interesting aspect, apart from a generalized increase in the number of clinical trials that were funded and supported by the industry, also an increase in the number of clinical trials and generally clinical research activities that is coming from academia. And then third aspect, and again, very important, studies by the type of intervention. Here we have evaluated, depending on the definition using clinicaltrial.gov, if the drug that was used, or at least the type of intervention, was actually a drug, a biological type of intervention, or, for example, even a combination product. And here, well, we are still seeing that there is a generalized increase in the number of clinical trials, which is again reflecting what we are saying since the first slide. In the second period, so the last 10 years of 2002 to 2021 that we analyzed, there has been a generalized increase in the research activities and interest in nephrology. But the other thing is that if we take a look at the second period, the striking evidence it's the new clinical trials that are using biologicals. And this is a very important aspect because through biologicals, we can consider that there is a better understanding of the molecular target that could be used in order to treat some particular type of disease. I mean, the first reference that is coming to my mind is about the glomerulopathies, and for example, the use of complement inhibitors that are being tested right now in order to find new therapeutic approach to diseases like IgA nephropathy and lupus nephritis as well, just to mention some that are seeing a number of clinical trials that are being performed in the last period. And just thinking, for example, about the complement inhibition, there are at least 3 different complement activation, and within these 3 different component activation, there have been potentially already 33 targets that have been identified in order to develop new drugs. So again, summary of this further analysis related to the studies by type of intervention, the role that biologicals are having in the latest period compared to the first one. And another analysis that we finally run on our data sets is also the studies by the type of population in clinical trial publication. Now, here I will say that the most important aspect is related to the pediatric population, because there is still a very high unmet need in this population. Now, we can argue, for example, that as soon as new treatments would be approved for the other population, similarly, we would expect also future trials in the pediatric population as well. But evidence, once again, in the 2 periods that we have analyzed is that within this generalized increase in the number of clinical trials, pediatric trials are still a very, very small percentage, and our hope for the future, given that some of these diseases are already being diagnosed and have a very important component at early age, is that effective medication are going to be available to also the pediatric patients. Finally, if we consider also the number of clinical trials publication that were involved in publication, unfortunately, the trend is not really different, because if we consider the 2 periods, once again, while there has been a generalized increase in the number of publications, still those that are making reference to the pediatric population actually were slightly reduced. I mean, even if the reduction it's really, really small, from 11 to 10%. So again, in this case, making reference to study type of population and clinical trial publication, what we can see is that still research is needed in the pediatric population, and our hope for the next future is that we are going to see more clinical trials that hopefully are going to address diseases that are diagnosed at earlier ages, and in this case, going to slow down chronic kidney disease to a pace that the disease would be manageable for a longer period of time without, of course, dialysis or in this case, kidney transplant. And just to give you an idea of the size and to frame what does it mean in this case, clinical research in chronic kidney disease, I'm making reference to 2 particular diseases that, as I repeated many times during this presentation, are seeing an incredible interest by the industry. And the first one is the IgA nephropathy, and the second one is lupus nephritis. For IgA nephropathy, after years of standard management of blood pressure and, for example, treatment, just making reference to the KDIGO guidelines with the max tolerated dose of ACE inhibitors or IRBs. For the first year in 2022, we have seen a drug that was approved. Actually, it is an oral formulation of budesonide, but at the same time, we can just see here the number of drugs that are currently under development. I've just reported here those that right now are in active clinical research development, and there are two important aspects that I would like to highlight. The first one is the number of assets, number of drugs that are being developed. But the other important aspect, and you can just see on the right part of our slide under the abbreviation, is the number of molecular targets that these new drugs are intended to target, of course. And this relates to what I was saying about a better understanding of the renal pathophysiology. And so in this case, the opportunity through basic research and academia as well to identify the new targets that are expected to, for example, reduce the inflammation in the specific case of IgA nephropathy. And the second example as well is about lupus nephritis. Also here, class 5, just an example with the nephrotic syndrome. So again, RAS blocker with blood pressure control as a main treatment, combined also with immunosuppressive treatment with glucocorticoids and other agents as well, like mycophenolate mofetil or calcineurin inhibitors. But again here, let's take a look at the number of drugs that are under development. And this is, of course, raising up our expectation, but also believe that there could be quite a brighter future for patients that are affected about this disease, because depending on the results of the phase 3 clinical trials, new treatment options are going to be available for these patients in the next future. So very interesting and positive news. So in the first part of this presentation, we have reviewed, starting from a historical, let's say, definition of chronic kidney disease, what it's moving in the background, and what are the news. But there's a second aspect that is very important, and the second aspect is actually reflecting a change in the approach by generally the pharmaceutical industry and the regulator that has started years ago, which is summarized in the definition of patient centricity. And it means how to make sure that the patient perspective, or at least patient inputs, are made available and are used in order to improve the quality of clinical trial design and of study protocols, in order to incentivize as well clinical research in the next future. And for example, the first evidence is that coming directly from the regulators to have a better or a higher voice of patients in clinical research development activities. For example, in the United States, once again, we're just making reference to what the FDA has released in the meantime in order to amplify the patient voice, just like we are saying in our title. That's something that starts back in 2016 with the Century Cures Act, where there were several mandates, but one of the most important is this request for a brief statement that it's summarizing patients' experience data. And somehow we have seen also the importance of the patient's voice, maybe if we consider in the patient-reported outcomes, in many clinical trials that are not only intended to test what is the endpoint that is generally used as a clinical evidence that this drug is effective, but at the same time also a meaningful endpoint for the patient. So is the drug effective? Yes, no, but also is the drug considered effective by the patient as well? For example, with all introduction of instruments that are measuring quality of life. So the question is that when the drug is being taken by the patient, apart from the clinical efficacy, can we also consider that the drug is considered efficacious as well by the patient, for example, in improving several aspects of his or her life? The other point is these FDA patient-focused drug development meetings that are held. And again, the primary aim of this meeting, of these meetings, is to better incorporate the patient's voice. Once again, we have this definition, which is recurring very often in drug development evaluation. Similarly, to the moves from the FDA, also in Europe, the European Medicine Agency, it's working with a special working party, that is the patients and customer working party, in order to formalize the engagement process of patients. And again, the final goal is having a patient's input in the regulatory process, but also in clinical development and the clinical research activities. And from 2016, there has been also a pilot project for the inclusion of patients in the meetings of the Committee for the Medicinal Products for Human Use, which means the committee that is responsible for the evaluation and the approval of new drugs in the European Union. And there are also some joint FDA and the EMA patients engagement cluster that were formed starting from 2016 in order to share what are the best practices. So in summary and conclusion, patient voice is definitely one of the most important aspects that we need to consider in the future of clinical research, and to be incorporated also in how clinical trials are going to be designed in the next future. And there's a reason, of course, because the patients are key contributors. Now, let me just make an example related to how much it is important to include patients and their patient's perspective. Let's consider, for example, a study in patients that are under dialysis. Now, protocol can be, of course, extremely complex, but somehow it is important to consider also what the patients are doing in their normal, let's say, treatment life, and how a study design can better leverage what is their use and experience in order to improve the clinical trial design and avoid that the clinical trial procedures are becoming more burdensome to patients. So again, we are a very real life example. If we consider that the patients under dialysis coming to the dialysis unit every 3 days, more or less, ideally, a clinical trial protocol that it's going to study the efficacy of a new drug in this population should be built in order to better leverage this very regular schedule, and of course avoid that the patients are coming back, for example, to the clinic or the hospital for additional visits within the same week. That, of course, is going to be an additional burden for patients beyond their regular dialysis events during the week. So just coming back to why patients are key contributors. So we can consider that in clinical research and clinical trial developments, there are different stakeholders. We talked already about the regulatory agency, like, for example, the FDA in the United States and the EMA in Europe, just to mention some. But at the same time, we have pharmaceutical industry as well, and of course, patients. So patients are key contributors for several aspects that are quite important. I was mentioning, for example, measuring the burden of the disease and just trying to have the patient's perspective in order to better design study protocols and understand how clinical research is going to be, first of all, meaningful for patients. But secondly, also how this could be easier for patients. We are moving our perspective from clinical trial protocols that were intended to be at the predominant use of regulatory agency and pharmaceutical industry in order to test the efficacy of drug, also to incorporate this patient's perspective, as I have already explained in past slides. The other important thing is that patients can also identify what is meaningful and important for them. So how to design a clinical research or a clinical trial in order to identify also endpoints that are meaningful for patients. And as we have seen, these are the same endpoints that could be required by then a regulatory agency in order to evaluate the efficacy and the added value of the new drug. And the other important thing beyond just trying to identify what it is too much, so what we have considered also as burdensome, it's to have patients' perspective on the risk-benefit ratio. And again, it always comes to the very same objective, just trying to understand through the patient's voice what it is going to be important for them as people that, of course, are suffering some type of disease. And we can see what is the value of patient inputs depending on the phase of clinical research. So preclinical at phase 1, for those that are not really familiar with the terms, it means the early stage clinical research. And in this case, the patient's voice, it is important in order to characterize the burden of the disease and share what is their experience. The other important thing is just trying to understand what is their journey from time to diagnosis to treatment, and what they are once again experiencing in their patient life, and also define what are the key impacts depending on the disease areas. And the other thing is just trying to understand if in the patient's opinion, in their experience, there are some particular barriers in the way that their disease is treated, or for example, if in this moment, just like we said at the very beginning, speaking about the early stages of research in kidney disease, there is still a very unmet need that they don't see it's being addressed by current treatment or, for example, by current medical practice. And then moving later, in the later stage of clinical research, so phases of clinical trials that are intended to test and confirm the true efficacy of new drug, they can provide inputs on the protocol design, how, for example, they can better what are the advices from patients in order to improve the recruitment, so how patients are going to be included in the study, and retention as well. So how make the clinical trial experience better for patients in order to avoid that some of them are just deciding for whatever reason to not participate or to decline their participation at later stages in the trial. They can, of course, provide inputs on the definition of the clinical outcome, and define also what are the meaningful benefit of new treatments that are being tested in clinical research. So once again, just like we are used to do in every of these slides, summarizing concept of why it is so important to have the patient voice in clinical trials, that independently from the stage, patients are going to share their experience. And of course, it is in their best interest and the interest of future patients that are going to be diagnosed or maybe to come in the future, trying to have a better experience and be sure that how clinical research is structured is going to be meaningful for them, and especially that their inputs are going to improve the way that we are designing clinical research and clinical trials in the future. And so for this reason, that is important to have a patient-centric approach. So again, what is the regulatory perspective, why the patient voice is so important, and how to have a patient-centric approach. So patient centricity in this case means having the involvement of patients since the very early stage of clinical research. And through this inclusion of patients since the very early stages, we truly believe that clinical trials are going to make more accessible, comfortable, and efficient for people that are suffering, for example, the disease. And by a review of past data, the striking evidence in this case is that those companies that have used patients' inputs in the design of the trials were about 20% more likely to have a new drugs launched onto the market. And if we consider, for example, what is the involvement of patients' association right now in some particular diseases that are still seeing a very high unmet need, and what is the contribution and their enthusiasm and true excitement in ensuring that clinical trial and the opportunity to participate in clinical trial, it's widespread across all the community. Again, this is a very important evidence on how the true and engaged patient participation, it is important to improve clinical research and clinical trials. The other interesting thing is that in a very interconnected world, just like the one we are living in, with this incredible use of social media, there is also another important aspect, is that the patients are talking between themselves and they are sharing their experience. So there are a number of online communities that are being formed in order to share, for example, apart from the experience, also the feedback about treatments, about the efficacy of these treatments, and about also physicians, for example, and the way that patients are interacting with physicians during a clinical trial, so during their normal, let's say, therapeutic life. And for this reason, the monitoring somehow, rather than monitoring the use of social media, even in order to engage a patient's community, became a very important aspect. Apart from the use of social media for engagement opportunity, let's also consider what is going to be the important role of technology in the next future. We have seen after these 2 years of pandemic, where access to hospitals, for example, have been restricted, how much it was important to develop alternative technology, thinking about video calls, for example, or even remote clinic visits, in order to still keep a connection with patients that by personal decision or by a decision related to the safeguard of people working in the hospitals, were somehow limited in their access to visits and to their physicians. And just like every one of us in these last 2 years had to spend some more time at home compared to times pre-pandemic. And so there has been an incredible development, for example, of mobile application that were used for different purposes, including also the adverse events reporting. Or let's also consider the use of wearables. We know that there are a number of applications, thinking about smartwatches, just like they are called, that have several apps that are monitoring our biorhythm, for example, or our physical activity, and somehow are advising us on some particular aspects. This is another very good example on how technology is going to influence the future of clinical research. And new wearables technology could be used in order to have ongoing monitoring of some very important vital function or other aspects related to a particular type of disease that could be meaningful, in order to show a true improvement in some physical, let's say, indicators during, for example, a clinical trial, or even outside, let's say, clinical research activities. So technology is definitely going to have a very important role. But here, once again, the segue from our main topic of patients' experience and patients' involvement in clinical research activity. Patients are very active on social media. They are organizing themselves in community where they are sharing their experience about their disease and trying to get not really professional advice only, because of course for that one they are making requests to their physicians, but at least having an opportunity with social media in order to meet with other people and share with their experience, and trying to understand even how they can better improve their experience with the disease by sharing a different perspective. And in this case, the use of social media related to clinical research, it's once again very important in order to have a better understanding of what patients are thinking and they are experiencing as well, in order to better design clinical research and clinical trials. So again, this is the main goal, just trying to have a better experience for patients and be sure that clinical research activity is going to be interesting for them, and being able to better explain what are the goals, the objective, and especially that this is targeted in order to improve their life and the life of future patients that are going to be diagnosed with the same disease. So finally, what are the conclusions of this session, and what we can actually say about the advances in research in chronic kidney disease? First of all, disease prevalence is on the rise. By 2040, as we said since the very beginning, chronic kidney disease is going to be the 5th leading cause of death. So it is very important that we start to think prospectively about how we are going to address chronic kidney disease in the next future, and invest in order to find the new treatments that are going to slow down or potentially stop completely chronic kidney disease. The other important thing is that if we consider the number of clinical trials that were performed in the last 20 years, what we have done in our research, dividing these 20 years into periods of 10 years, what we have seen is that there has been a 54% increase in the number of clinical trials, but most importantly, there has been a doubling of the number of clinical trials in early phase that, as we explained, it's the gateway for the large phase 3 pivotal trials that are going to confirm the efficacy of the new treatment. This, of course, has been fostered by a better understanding of the renal pathophysiology. And during this session, we made already the link with, for example, a number of monoclonal antibodies that have been tested. As you remember in one of the slides, we said that from almost no biologicals that were tested in the first period, we had about 39 biologicals that were tested in the second period. And in this case, having a monoclonal antibody means having the opportunity to have a very targeted effect, or at least a potential very targeted effect on some receptors, or inhibition of some receptors that are going to stop, for example, molecular pathways that are promoting kidney inflammation. And the final consideration that we shared is that patient voice is going to be really important. From a regulators and pharmaceutical industry perspective, the new chapter of clinical research is going to see a stronger involvement of patients in order to understand how to make a clinical research more accessible, more interesting, and as good experience for patients, trying to reduce the burdensome, the burden of participating in clinical trial, and trying to make it a positive experience, not only for patients now, but also for those that are going to come in the next future. And for this reason, incorporation of patients' inputs since the very early stages of clinical research in defining endpoints, structure of studies, and how, for example, to make a study protocol more accessible, interesting for patients. It's one of the main industry trends that we are seeing in this moment. And with this last slide, first of all, I would like to thank once again the Sociedad Argentina de Nefrología for inviting me in this speech. It's been a very interesting opportunity, and I would just like to acknowledge some people that helped me in presenting this session. First of all, of course, the SAN directives, Dr. Guillermo Roselies and Dr. Alicia Isabel Fayad, then some other colleagues from Thermo Fisher Scientific and a clinical research group in general medicine that helped me in putting together and reviewing these slides. So with these last thanking slides, I would like to thank you once again for your interest and for the time that you spent on this presentation. And in case of any follow-up question, you are very welcome to reach me on my social channels, actually just one. I have a profile on LinkedIn, so just type my name, or if you would like to contact me directly by email, my email address is davide.garrisi@ppd.com. So if you are interested in joining or having some future type of discussion, I would welcome your emails. With this one, thanks again for your interest and for attending this session today, and goodbye.
Dr. Davide, we appreciate your presentation, all the information provided, and the opportunity to develop different investigations that can generate relevant benefits for our patients. Muchísimas gracias por la oportunidad, también a Chris Miller, y voy a pedirle a Rosario Luxardo o Agustina Heredia Martínez, que son miembros del comité de investigación, que pueden ir redactando las preguntas para que Davide o Chris nos ayuden para contestarlas.
Hola. Yo no estoy... Yo tengo un par de preguntas. En realidad, por ahí, mientras por ahí Agus se fija si hay preguntas. La voy a hacer primero en castellano, si no es molestia, después la hago en inglés. O sea, el primer trabajo, la verdad es que muchas gracias, porque es muy interesante lo que presentó, doctor. Quería consultarle sobre la primera parte por ahí de la presentación, donde hicieron un análisis sobre todas las publicaciones y sobre todos los trials que están publicados en clinicaltrial.gov, para ver si por ahí tuvieron la oportunidad de hacer un subanálisis de lo que está sucediendo acá en nuestra región, en Latinoamérica o en Argentina. Le hago la pregunta en inglés. I was wondering if maybe when you were doing your research on all the trials published in clinicaltrials.gov, if maybe you had the opportunity to make a sub-analysis on what is going on here in Latin America or in Argentina. Can you hear me?
Se te escucha bien, Rosario. Seguramente te está escuchando bien. Doc. Davide, have you heard the question that Luxardo made you or not?
Creo que hay un poco de delay con YouTube, está en la pantalla de YouTube, ahí le acabo de avisar.
Okay, we are in,
que por ahí pasa el Zoom.
We are in Zoom. Cristina, yo no puedo ver las preguntas, ¿dónde las vemos?
Oh, está diciendo que no nos puede escuchar. Bruno, ¿sabes si puede ser algo en particular?
A Rosario y a nosotros nos escuchamos bien. Había que decirle que
veo su micrófono que está abierto y es raro que no le esté funcionando. Quizás porque tiene que poner el audio del Zoom. Porque a él lo escuchamos. De hecho, tipo, estoy escuchando los ruidos de él.
Sí.
Ahí está, justamente por eso, el micrófono le está funcionando.
Ok.
Preguntarle si escucha el YouTube. Porque si no escucha ya es algo de la máquina y tengo que tengo que decirle varias cosas que haga.
David, can you hear us now? No. Quizás enrollamos mientras que David va conectando o reiniciando el micrófono. Por ahí yo puedo contestar. Él puede contestar específicamente de la parte del análisis que se hizo desde de la revisión de los documentos. Lo que sí podemos comentar es que lo que sí sabemos es que históricamente Latinoamérica, ha sido contribuyente para ensayos clínicos, pero bueno, también pasamos por una época en la que era difícil obtener aprobaciones regulatorias y eso también, entre los tiempos regulatorios que eran...
Te apagaste el micrófono, Cristina.
Creo que sí, recién, creo que ahí fue. De lo que la ANMAT, de los tiempos regulatorios que la ANMAT está, más comprometido a mantener en este tiempo, ha habido más interés, porque una cosa era presentar, digamos, tiempos regulatorios que fuesen, digamos, impredecibles, digamos, a tiempos regulatorios que son predecibles como pasa, digamos, en este momento. Por eso mirando para 20 años atrás, quizás es difícil decir exactamente cuál era la historia, porque ahí en esa época Argentina estaba difícil para tener ensayos clínicos.
Claro.
Eso está cambiando, obviamente, por un tema regulatorio, también obviamente porque una de las cosas que para nosotros es interesante es que se habla mucho y es un tema que quizás digamos, queremos desarrollar mucho más, que es el requerimiento de tener diversidad de la población que participa en ensayos clínicos. Eso es un ítem extremadamente importante también para, digamos, para la FDA y para, digamos, todas las entidades regulatorias. Y obviamente eso implica la colaboración de pacientes, digamos, y la incorporación de pacientes en ensayos clínicos que no sean solamente de una cierta región, como puede ser Estados Unidos, Europa del Este, que eran siempre los países que son contribuyentes. Pero bueno, ahora David nos escucha, si quieres repetirle la pregunta, podemos completar esa parte.
I asked earlier if maybe, I was wondering if when you performed the research on the trials published on clinicaltrials.gov, if there maybe you had the possibility to perform a sub-analysis of what is going on in Latin America or maybe in Argentina?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me first of all?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Okay. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, so, well, I mean, that's a very good question, and I must say that's the reason why we are also so happy about the partnership that we are going to have with the Argentinian Society of Nephrology. So generally, that's the problem. If you consider, especially when there's a certain interest in a very, let's say, trendy therapeutic area, the distribution of trial, it's pretty much focused on North America, so United States, and Europe. Generally, what you see is that these two regions, and of course right now there's a certain tendency to China, are covering more or less 75% of the entire clinical trials that are performed worldwide, with a small number that it's conducted, for example, in Latin America, and of course the biggest number you always see in Argentina and in Brazil. So actually that's, let's say, the problem statement, because we are confident that, especially in some type of disease, I mean, during my presentation, I've always made the reference to lupus nephritis and IgA nephropathy. Now, just to give you an idea of what it means right now, researching two areas, in our research, we were considering that between 2017 to now, the number of clinical trials in IgA nephropathy moved to 4 to 22 in 3 years. And one of the problems is that sites, patients, and physicians in Europe and in North America are completely exhausted. So the reason why we need to diversify our approach and trying to strengthen also our collaboration with scientific association, just like in this case, it's in order to make, let me use this term, clinical research more democratic, and try to expand as much as possible in other geography, because first of all, it's a matter of interest for physicians to participate in global trials, but the other important thing is making a test drug that are showing really efficacy available also to patients that are not living in Western Europe or in North America.
Okay, thank you. Por ahí, si no hay otra pregunta todavía del público, yo tengo otra pregunta más.
Las preguntas, perdón, del público, Cristina, ¿se ven dónde? ¿Por YouTube o por dónde? Pues no la estoy viendo yo.
Se ven por YouTube. No hay,
Okay.
no hay preguntas, Rosario, así que tranquilo.
Ok, seguimos.
Bien, perfecto. Entonces, lo mismo, la hago primero en castellano y después la hago en inglés. Últimamente, sobre todo por ahí en los últimos años, se está utilizando mucho y está empezando a pisar cada vez más fuerte lo que es datos de evidencia real, datos de real world data o real world evidence, que quizás están ocupando un nicho y un lugar muy especial dentro de lo que es la investigación. Entonces quería saber por ahí cómo veía David con la experiencia que tiene en investigación en nefrología, cuál sería quizás el futuro de la investigación en nuestra parte, en nuestra especialidad específicamente, y si quizás este tipo de análisis o este tipo de diseños o este tipo de estudios quizás podría llegar a tener alguna utilidad, o cuál es la experiencia quizás con este tipo de estudios, ¿no? So, what I was wondering is, how do you see the future of research for maybe, I don't know, maybe the next year, maybe in the next few years, taking into account that real-world data and real-world evidence are taking the lead nowadays in the designs on studies and are becoming more and more useful, maybe for specific diseases, maybe not us, I don't know, but maybe because you have such an experience in nephrology. I was wondering what was your opinion on this?
Yeah, thanks. And again, thank you, because this is a another very important and interesting question. So what I see for the next future in nephrology, since you were speaking about real-world evidence, it's a great number of new trials. As soon as some of these medications are going to be marketed, they are going to investigate, of course, the use of these drugs in real life settings. Now, let's consider that, and in this case, I'm not talking about nephrology, but just making a parallel with oral let's say the oral pills, contraceptional use of drugs. So there was a very interesting review which was released by the FDA, as far as I remember, it was 2 years ago, when they were making a comparison between controlled randomized clinical trials and the prescribed use of anticonceptional pills to be taken during the week or during the month, and what was really happening in real life. In real life, the average dosage of this medication was 50%. Like, for example, the women sometimes were skipping one pill, or sometimes were skipping 1 week of pills. So this is going to be, in my opinion, the very interesting aspect that we are going to see in the next future. First of all, just trying to understand how medications are going to be used, because let's consider that the trendy, or let's say the trend, it's towards two main routes of administration. The first one, which is quite common for monoclonal antibody, it is a subcutaneous, sometimes self-injection. But we also have the new class of endothelin receptor antagonists, so sparsentan, atrasentan, that are going to be oral. So here, especially considering that the ultimate goal is to reduce inflammation and delay as much as possible the time to, let's say, higher stages of chronic kidney disease, is that in real life, and depending, of course, on cost of medications as well, are patients going to comply with their medications, or, for example, despite clinical trials are shown to be so efficacious, with at least 35 to even 43% of reduction in proteinuria, in this case, still patients needs to be educated to compliance. And, for example, here, another very important aspect is let's consider the very big chapter that is opening on the sodium and glucose cotransporter inhibitors. These are medications that are already used for diabetes. And thinking that this can be used as well to decrease the progression to CKD, that's extremely interesting. Also because, for example, in Europe or in other countries where the national health system doesn't work with insurances, but there's, of course, some types of co-payments for patients, some of these medications are going to expire in a few years, and so probably we are going to see generics that are going to be cheaper as well, and so in this case more affordable for patients. Very last point about the future of nephrology, which is another important topic that I was discussing with another physician: combination products. Now, of course, we need to see how to combine different type of drugs, but think about the maybe synergic effect of a combination drug that is going to have dapagliflozin or empagliflozin and sparsentan or atrasentan. Of course, maybe this could be a very crazy idea, but just like it happened with the combination products in cardiovascular, or for example in asthma as well, where you have a corticosteroid and beta-2 agonist, think about having an SGLT2 inhibitors and for example, an endothelin receptor antagonist mixed together a different dosage. And we know that in pharmacology, 1+1 sometimes get 3 rather than 2. And so maybe you can have an additive effect, which is going to be renal protective, and at the same time also reducing inflammation through 2 different mechanisms of action.
Okay, thank you. Great.
Quería hacer una preguntita pequeña, que es en qué forma o cuál es el camino para que los nefrólogos argentinos puedan acceder o participar en los ensayos clínicos que nos acaban de dar a conocer que existen, ¿no?, en otros continentes. How can Argentine nephrologists assess or participate in clinical trials?
David,
Yeah, so
do you want to
no,
take
no.
it? I can take it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, great.
Bueno, por ahí lo puedo contestar en español. Creo que una de las cosas que son fundamentales, creo que la presentación de la encuesta creo que es un primer indicio de qué es lo que se precisa. Y creo que junto con esto que decía David, de que la pregunta previa, de que ciertas regiones como los Estados Unidos, Europa, recibieron tantos estudios todos juntos en un periodo muy corto. Es cierto que en realidad ahí está como saturado la potencialidad de estos investigadores para enrolar pacientes, con lo cual, acá tenemos una forma, es un momento para que Argentina, o Latinoamérica en general, pero también Argentina como un país, como decía David, que son los países que más participan en los ensayos en particular, tengan todavía más presencia. Claro que con esto también implica lo mismo que hablamos, porque implica desarrollar más centros, más profesionales que puedan hacer la investigación. Veíamos que hay muchos investigadores o nefrólogos que fueron subinvestigadores, que quizás en realidad pueden dar el próximo paso a ser los investigadores principales de estudios. Una de estas cosas de la palabra democrática, yo usaría la palabra federal, porque creo que una de las cosas que pasa también es que Argentina es muy grande, las distancias son muy largas entre un lugar y otro, y creo que la posibilidad de tener centros que realicen ensayos clínicos afuera de Buenos Aires, Córdoba o Rosario, son fundamentales, porque en Salta o en Tucumán o en Santa Cruz también en realidad hay pacientes que pueden ser potenciales candidatos a estos ensayos y que en general también no tienen acceso a estas posibilidades. El hablar del entrenamiento que decíamos es una de las cosas que nos encantaría también hacer parte con la SAN. La doctora Fayad, Alicia, vos tenés gran participación en esto con entrenar y como promover las nuevas generaciones de nefrólogos que tengan interés en investigación de parte del Comité de Investigación de la SAN. Eso es un tema fundamental porque para hacer investigación clínica se precisa ciertas calificaciones, como saber de buenas prácticas clínicas, se precisa un entrenamiento que es más específico, que no es el que los nefrólogos que hacen práctica clínica habitualmente tienen. Pero justamente nada es imposible, y en realidad está la experiencia, evidentemente muchos ya la tienen como subinvestigadores, hay otros que se pueden incorporar a equipos de trabajo que ya están armados, y eso también consolida más tener equipos que puedan referir pacientes, que vean pacientes no solamente en un solo lugar, sino que también haya mucha referencia de pacientes para los pacientes que estén en otro lado, accedan a esto. Y bueno, y de nuestra parte obviamente es colaborar con todo esto, y también obviamente es proponer a Argentina, que es una de las cosas que estuvimos haciendo, y que estamos intentando, es hacer, muchos de ustedes son nombres muy conocidos, no solamente en Argentina, sino en Latinoamérica y también, a nivel global. Hoy justamente miraba que el doctor Hernán Trimarche es parte del comité de la Sociedad Internacional de Nefrología. Eso implica y también muestra la calidad de la nefrología en Argentina y los profesionales. Con lo cual, tenemos lo que hacemos, o lo que queremos, sabemos quiénes están, y también queremos hacer nuestro compromiso de proponer a Argentina, dentro de los países. Y justamente no es basado solamente en porque queremos proponer Argentina, o porque yo soy de Argentina, sino que en realidad es basado en los ensayos o los estudios que ustedes publican, las estadísticas que se publican, no pasan desapercibidos aunque ustedes cuenten solamente cuáles son los pacientes que ven y cuál es la proteinura con la que llegan, no es información que pasa desapercibida. Por eso toda esa investigación de algún punto básica, observacional que hacen en la práctica habitual, tiene un gran impacto en lo que nosotros tomamos desde nuestro lado para decir que hay un país que puede participar en ensayos clínicos. Y eso lo hacemos constantemente, obviamente sin tener con Argentina, con el resto de los países, pero obviamente accedemos a información que está disponible de las publicaciones que ustedes hacen y con eso nos nutrimos para saber cuál es la población que está disponible en un país.
Gracias, Cris, muchísimas gracias. La idea es, en este espacio, generar todas las posibilidades, que es como lo habíamos hablado con la comisión directiva, con David, contigo, con las chicas desde el comité, generar oportunidades para todos, o sea, con absoluta transparencia para que todos puedan acceder a la investigación, para aquellos los que nos gusta muchísimo, que lo descubrimos desde hace mucho tiempo, pero que todos tengan acceso. Aquel que está en la Patagonia, por ejemplo, Agustina, que está empezando a desarrollar en el Hospital de Calafate, pueda acceder y no vea truncado a una parte muy importante de su profesión, que es la investigación. Así que
Exacto.
Nosotros sumamente agradecidos, más que estuvimos viendo lo que dijo David en relación a nefritis lúpica, IgA, nefrótico, que son patologías de todos los días, y saber que tenemos la oportunidad de generar estrategias terapéuticas diferentes que pueden beneficiar a nuestros pacientes, eso desde ya nos pone muy contentos. Así que desde el comité vamos a preparar todas las herramientas necesarias para formar a quienes quieran, porque van a tener el acceso. Todo aquel que quiere generosamente va a tener la formación que necesite para poder ayudar y generar toda esta masa crítica de nefrólogos nueva, mediana o vieja generación que quiera participar en investigación. Yo cuento con excelentes colaboradores en el comité, está Marcelo Ferde, está Cecilia Mengalelli, Rosa Díez, así que tenemos mucha gente formada y muchas ganas para hacerlo, así que contamos con el apoyo desde ya desde ustedes, ¿no?
Sin dudas.
Bueno. ¿Querés comentar algo más o David querrá decir algo más y nos cerramos?
David, do you want to add, anything else, to the conversation, otherwise, to wrap up?
No, first, just to say that I have understood what Dr. Fayyad said. That's great. And just to say that, of course, we are really committed with that one. So that's definitely something that we need to work together. On one side, having the new generation, just like Dr. Fayyad was saying, of nephrologists in Argentina that are going to be training clinical research. And then our job is going to keep on promoting, just like we are doing, the quality of Argentinian physicians in order to have more and more clinical trials that are going to perform there. And of course, anything that is needed in order to help in training this new generation, especially on aspects related to good clinical practices and whatever it is needed in order to have this qualification, let's say, to access to clinical trial, we're more than happy to help. I mean, this is, let's say, a first example of our collaboration, but we hope and we are confident that many more will come in the next future because we truly believe in it.
No te escuchamos, Agustina, si estás hablando.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Davide. It was really interesting, everything you exposed recently, and of course, it's like a commitment for everybody here in Argentina to start and to try to do more investigation in nephrology field. So it's something that we need to promote and divulgate in our society and in our specialty. So more doctors and more nephrologists start doing investigation in our country. It's something that we need to start doing more.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Ok, yo creo que de nuestro lado, muchas gracias de nuevo a la SAN en general, digamos, al doctor Rosa Vies, a la doctora Marina Papaginovich, que estuvo trabajando también un montón para esto sea posible, Bruno en este caso y la gente de audiovisuales, Alicia por todo, por la disponibilidad para poder empezar a hablar de esto, que creo que fue un acercamiento más de inquietud y terminó entendiendo esta posibilidad que, como dice David, es la primera de muchas que esperamos tener con esto, con el compromiso de justamente promover el acceso, digamos, a otras oportunidades terapéuticas para los pacientes en general, y para justamente que las drogas que nuevamente salgan al mercado también tengan la representación, digamos, de la población en la que van a ser usadas, digamos, porque como decimos siempre, no es lo mismo, y esto de tener al paciente en el centro, que parece un tema superficial, digamos, o una cosa más, pero es fundamental porque en realidad no es lo mismo un paciente de Estados Unidos que un paciente de Argentina, no sé, de la provincia de Tucumán, que viene del interior y tiene que hacer determinados cambios en la forma de su día para poder participar de un ensayo clínico. Todas esas cosas son cosas que queremos tener en cuenta también, y bueno, y que sean escuchadas, y que a partir de eso podamos hacer ensayos clínicos en todos lados, o por lo menos con pacientes que en realidad no sean pacientes que vengan de muchos lados. Y eso a la diversidad, que es un tema fundamental para nosotros también, tener el paciente en el centro, son todas cosas que también nos mueven a buscar centros e investigadores y pacientes que estén en lugares donde después las drogas van a ser usadas. Así que de vuelta, muchas gracias por la oportunidad, y muchas gracias por el interés también en esto, y por la colaboración, que es un montón, porque en realidad los días de ustedes como médicos están llenos de cosas, y hacer el espacio para algo más es sumamente valioso. Así que muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a ustedes por su tiempo, por su generosidad, por brindarnos toda esta información, y bueno, nos vemos pronto. See you soon.
Nos vemos pronto. Muchas gracias.
Muchas
Buenas noches a todos.
Gracias.